A wild fox once carried her kit to a hiker's doorstep and simply left it there, watching from the tree line until the hiker picked it up. Stories like this exist across nearly every continent, involving nearly every species imaginable. Cats, dogs, birds, even wild animals with no history of human contact at all. An animal, driven by instinct built over millions of years to protect its offspring above almost anything else, deliberately chooses to hand that offspring over to a human. But here's what makes this genuinely strange. Trusting a completely different species with your most vulnerable offspring should be an evolutionary disadvantage, not an instinct that gets passed down. So why does it keep happening across species that have never even been domesticated? Comment below and tell me if this has ever happened to you, because by the end of this video, you'll understand the surprisingly calculated instinct hiding behind what looks like one of the most trusting acts in the entire animal kingdom. At first glance, this behavior seems to violate one of the most basic rules of animal parenting. Across nearly every species, protecting offspring from outside threats, including other species, is one of the strongest instincts that exists. Mother animals will fight, injure themselves, and take enormous personal risk to keep predators away from their young. So when a mother cat carries a newborn kitten directly to a human, or when a mother bird nudges a fallen chick toward a person standing nearby, it initially looks like a complete contradiction. Why would an instinct built entirely around protection ever include handing that vulnerable offspring to a member of an entirely different species? For a long time, this behavior was explained away as coincidence, confusion, or simple desperation, a parent unable to cope, dumping a problem onto whoever happened to be nearby. But researchers who study animal behavior more closely have found that explanation doesn't hold up particularly well. In many documented cases, the animal isn't behaving erratically or randomly. It's behaving with clear intention, often approaching a specific person, in a specific way, at a specific moment. That distinction matters enormously. Random, panicked behavior looks very different from deliberate, targeted behavior. And once researchers started treating this as deliberate rather than accidental, an entirely different explanation started to take shape. One rooted not in confusion, but in a very old, very calculated survival strategy. To understand what's really happening, you have to understand how animals build something researchers sometimes call a trust hierarchy, an internal ranking system many species use to judge which nearby individuals are safe, which are dangerous, and which fall somewhere in between. This isn't unique to interactions with humans. Animals build trust hierarchies with other animals constantly, even other species entirely. Certain birds tolerate the presence of grazing animals nearby because those animals pose no threat and sometimes stir up insects as they move. Certain fish allow cleaner shrimp to approach extremely close, despite an instinctive fear response toward nearly everything else that gets that near. Humans, for many animals living in close proximity to us, eventually get sorted into this same trust hierarchy. A cat that has repeatedly experienced calm, non-threatening interactions with a specific person builds an internal model of that person as safe, reliable, and non-threatening. Over enough repeated positive interactions, that person can end up ranked, in the animal's internal system, somewhere close to how it would rank another trusted member of its own social group. This matters enormously when a mother animal is under stress. A threatened environment, an unstable nesting location, a perceived predator nearby. These situations activate an urgent need to relocate offspring somewhere safer. And when an animal is scanning its environment for the safest available option, a human who has consistently ranked high on that internal trust hierarchy can genuinely become one of the safest perceived choices available, sometimes even safer than remaining with the mother in an unstable location. This reframes the entire behavior. It's not confusion, it's not desperation without direction. It's an animal actively using its own trust assessment system, the same system it uses to evaluate every other potential threat or ally in its environment, and concluding that a specific human represents the safest available option for its offspring in that particular moment. It's worth emphasizing just how selective this trust hierarchy typically is. Most animals that display this behavior don't treat humans in general as safe. They treat one specific, familiar human, or occasionally a small handful of consistently encountered people, as safe, while remaining just as wary of unfamiliar humans as they would be of any other unknown variable in their environment. This selectivity is actually strong evidence against the idea that this behavior is some kind of generalized species-wide instinct. If it were purely instinctual and untargeted, we'd expect animals to approach any nearby human indiscriminately during a crisis. Instead, the behavior is remarkably specific, often bypassing strangers entirely in favor of traveling further or waiting longer to reach one particular trusted individual. That specificity also helps explain why this behavior appears far more frequently in domestic and semi-domestic animals than in most fully wild species. Domestic cats, farm animals, and habituated urban wildlife such as certain fox or raccoon populations simply have far more opportunities to build this kind of individualized trust profile with specific humans through repeated, low-stakes daily contact. Fully wild animals living with minimal human contact rarely have the same opportunity to build that same kind of detailed trust ranking toward any single person, which is part of why documented cases involving genuinely wild, unhabituated species remain comparatively rare and tend to draw significant scientific interest when they do occur. But trust alone doesn't fully explain why this happens. There's a second ingredient necessary before this behavior appears, and it has everything to do with how animals judge, moment to moment, exactly how dangerous a situation actually is. Animals don't experience danger as a single, constant level of alertness. Instead, most species operate using a kind of sliding scale, constantly recalculating risk based on a combination of environmental cues, past experience, and current stress levels. A mother animal under low stress, in a stable environment, rarely considers handing offspring to a nearby human, even a trusted one, simply because there's no urgent need to. The current situation, however imperfect, still ranks as acceptably safe compared to the unknown risk of introducing a completely different species into the equation. Everything changes once perceived danger rises sharply. A nearby predator, a destroyed or compromised nesting site, a sudden environmental threat like flooding, fire, or extreme weather. In these moments, an animal's risk calculation shifts dramatically. The current situation, once rated as merely imperfect, suddenly gets reclassified as actively dangerous. Once that shift happens, the trust hierarchy discussed earlier becomes critical. The parent animal, now actively searching for any option safer than the current one, scans available choices. If a trusted human happens to be nearby, that person can suddenly outrank every other available option, including sometimes the parent's own current location or ability to protect the offspring directly. This explains a pattern researchers have repeatedly observed. This behavior tends to spike noticeably during specific triggering events. Wildlife rescue organizations report surges in these encounters following storms, wildfires, sudden habitat disruption, or the presence of a new predator in an area. It's rarely, if ever, a random occurrence spread evenly across time. It clusters tightly around moments of genuine, elevated danger. This also explains something that initially seems contradictory. If this behavior were simply about weak parenting or an animal giving up, we'd expect to see it most often from young, inexperienced, or struggling mothers. Instead, researchers frequently observe this exact behavior from mothers who otherwise show strong, capable, highly attentive parenting behavior in every other respect. These aren't parents abandoning offspring. They're parents making an active, calculated decision under acute, temporary threat. It's also worth noting how quickly this risk calculation can shift, sometimes within minutes rather than hours or days. A location that felt entirely safe at dawn can become genuinely threatening by midday if a predator's scent is detected nearby, or if unfamiliar movement is spotted at the edge of a territory. Because many animals lack the ability to physically fortify a location the way humans might, relocation becomes one of the only realistic responses available when danger escalates that quickly. Handing offspring to a trusted human, in that context, isn't a last resort born of helplessness. It's often simply the fastest, most reliable relocation option a stressed parent has access to in the moment. Researchers studying this pattern have also noted that the intensity of the behavior tends to match the severity of the perceived threat. A mild, ongoing low-level disturbance, such as increased human foot traffic near a nest, rarely triggers this kind of handoff behavior on its own. It typically takes a sharper, more acute spike in perceived danger to push an animal's risk calculation past the threshold, where relocating offspring to a different species suddenly becomes the preferable option. This threshold-based pattern is one of the clearest pieces of evidence that this behavior is closely tied to genuine, situational risk assessment rather than simple opportunism or confusion. While the underlying logic, trust plus acute danger equals relocation to a safer option, appears fairly consistent across many species, the specific behavior itself varies dramatically depending on the animal involved, shaped heavily by each species' own natural parenting instincts. Domestic cats offer one of the most commonly documented examples. A mother cat physically carrying a kitten by the scruff and depositing it near a trusted human closely mirrors the exact same behavior she would use to relocate a kitten to a safer den location within her own territory. In this case, the human isn't being treated as fundamentally different from any other safe location. The human has effectively become part of the cat's perceived safe territory. Birds show a different pattern entirely, often involving vocalization rather than physical transport. Certain bird species have been observed persistently calling near a human, appearing to lead that person toward a distressed or fallen chick, rather than physically relocating the chick themselves. Researchers studying this behavior suggest it may function similarly to alarm calls used to summon help from other members of the same species, just redirected toward a human perceived as capable of helping. Some marine mammals demonstrate an even more striking version of this behavior. Documented cases exist of dolphins nudging injured or distressed calves toward boats or swimmers, seemingly seeking direct intervention rather than simply relocating the calf to safety independently. Researchers studying dolphin cognition point to this as evidence of remarkably sophisticated risk assessment, given that dolphins have no evolutionary history of relying on humans for survival the way domesticated species do. This variation matters because it shows this isn't one single universal instinct expressed identically everywhere. It's closer to a shared underlying logic, expressed through whatever behavioral toolkit each individual species already has available for relocating or protecting offspring under normal circumstances. That raises an important question researchers have spent considerable time investigating. If this behavior requires trust built through repeated positive interaction, does that mean wild animals with no meaningful history of human contact are simply incapable of it entirely? Logically, you'd expect this behavior to appear almost exclusively in domesticated animals or wildlife that has had extensive, repeated positive contact with humans over time. And in many cases, that pattern holds true. But researchers have also documented cases involving wild animals with little or no prior direct interaction with the specific human involved, which complicates the simple explanation significantly. Some researchers argue that in these rarer cases, animals may be relying less on individual trust built through repetition and more on rapid, in-the-moment risk assessment based on observable behavior. An animal in acute crisis, actively scanning its immediate environment for the least dangerous available option, may make a fast judgment based on how a nearby human is currently behaving, calm, still, non-threatening posture, rather than any prior relationship history at all. This would suggest something even more remarkable than a simple learned trust system. It would suggest many animals retain a flexible, real-time capacity to assess a completely unfamiliar individual of a completely different species and make a rapid judgment about relative safety, purely based on immediate observable cues. This idea remains an active area of research, and scientists caution against assuming every documented case shares an identical explanation. Some encounters likely do involve prior positive experience with humans in general, even without a specific relationship to that individual person. Others may genuinely reflect rapid situational judgment. Distinguishing between these explanations in any individual case is often extremely difficult, since researchers rarely have complete information about an animal's full prior history with humans. What remains consistent, however, across nearly every documented case researchers have studied is the underlying pattern. Acute danger, combined with a perceived safer alternative, consistently precedes this behavior. Whether that trust was built over months or assessed within seconds, the core mechanism appears remarkably similar. Understanding why this behavior happens also reveals something important about how humans typically respond to it, and where that response sometimes goes wrong. A common instinct when encountering what looks like an animal deliberately handing over its offspring is to assume full, permanent responsibility immediately, removing the offspring entirely from the area. Wildlife rehabilitation experts caution that this instinct, however well-intentioned, can sometimes cause more harm than good, particularly with wild species. In many documented cases, the parent animal isn't necessarily abandoning the offspring permanently. It may be seeking temporary safety, protection, or intervention during an acute crisis, with every intention of returning once the immediate danger has passed. Removing offspring too quickly, before confirming the parent has genuinely left the area for good, can sometimes separate a family that would have otherwise safely reunited. This is particularly relevant with wild bird species, where well-meaning humans frequently assume a grounded fledgling has been abandoned, when in reality, the parent is often nearby, continuing to feed and protect the young bird from a distance during a normal developmental stage that simply looks alarming to an untrained observer. Wildlife experts generally recommend a careful, observation-first approach, assessing whether the offspring is genuinely injured or in immediate danger, monitoring briefly from a distance to check for a returning parent, and only intervening directly when there's clear evidence the animal is actually in danger, rather than treating every instance of proximity-seeking behavior as a permanent handoff. This doesn't mean the trust these animals place in humans isn't real. It clearly is, and it's remarkable. But understanding the actual mechanism behind the behavior, acute risk assessment rather than permanent abandonment, leads to better outcomes for the animals themselves, and a more accurate understanding of what's actually happening in that moment. There's a broader lesson here for anyone who spends significant time around animals, whether professionally or simply as a pet owner. The trust hierarchy discussed earlier isn't something that gets built once and then remains fixed forever. It's continuously updated based on ongoing behavior. Sudden, unpredictable movements, loud noises, or inconsistent handling can lower an animal's trust ranking of a specific person surprisingly quickly, even after months of positive interaction. Conversely, calm, predictable, low-stress interactions over time tend to reinforce and strengthen that ranking, making an animal more likely to view that person as a genuinely safe option during a future crisis. This is part of why wildlife rehabilitators are trained so extensively in reading subtle animal body language before intervening. A parent bird calling persistently near a human isn't necessarily signaling the same thing a parent bird silently avoiding that same human would be signaling. Learning to correctly interpret these signals, rather than assuming every encounter follows an identical script, is often the difference between a successful reunification and an unnecessary, permanent separation. Step back from any single species, and this behavior reveals something significant about animal cognition more broadly, something that challenges a common assumption people often make about instinct versus intelligence. Instinct is frequently framed as rigid and automatic, while intelligence is framed as flexible and calculated. This behavior blurs that line considerably. What looks, on the surface, like a simple instinctual reflex is, in many documented cases, closer to an active, real-time risk calculation, drawing on memory, environmental assessment, and rapid judgment of an entirely different species' trustworthiness. That an animal is capable of building a nuanced trust model of a human, tracking it over time, and then making a high-stakes decision under acute stress based on that model, suggests a level of cognitive flexibility that goes well beyond the simple stimulus-response instinct this behavior is sometimes reduced to. It also reframes what these encounters actually represent. Far from being a random, confused, or desperate act, an animal bringing its offspring to a human may represent one of the clearest possible demonstrations of cross-species trust in the natural world, a calculated decision made under genuine pressure that a member of an entirely different species represents the safest available option for what that animal values most. There's one detail we haven't mentioned yet. Some of the same researchers studying this behavior believe the trust hierarchy involved may not be one-directional at all, and that humans may be forming similar rapid trust assessments of specific animals without ever consciously realizing it. Which means this instinct might not be as one-sided as it first appears, and understanding it fully might require looking just as closely at how humans build trust with animals as we've looked at how animals build trust with us. Watch this next. Why do cats and dogs hate each other? And what researchers believe that reveals about trust across species lines.